technocracy. All right. Now, if you don't know what technocracy is, I'll give you a quick catch-up. Technocracy is a movement that started by someone called Howard Scott in the 1930s, who essentially thought that what you could do is you could take robots and generate enough robots such that they are going to do the bulk of the work in society. What would happen is that people who are mathematically and scientifically inclined, or experts in those fields, specifically science and math, would replace politicians and bureaucracy, and they would be the ones that make the decisions at the very, very top echelons of government. And they would do so based on a energy input and output. You as a human have such energy, and robots have such energy. And because energy is a closed system where you could make quantifiable calculations in terms of what energy a human can produce and a robot can produce, then what you can do is you can offer things like $20,000 a year income for every family, because you just extrapolate the long-term energy usage that a human, the long-term energy production that a human could offer to society, and you just pay them upfront over their life. The other thing that they included was the concept of energy bucks. And so energy bucks, energy dollars, means that all the output that you as a human produce in terms of energy will be given to you in a way that's unique to you. Think of this as blockchain. This was kind of the ideal behind blockchain. These are things that only you can have. They only belong to you, but it's taken to an extreme level. Even blockchain did not go as deep as energy bucks. So you can't even pass this on to your children. The idea would be that this would eliminate things like crime, because who's going to steal energy bucks from you if there's some, this amorphous way of identifying that these energy bucks don't belong to you anyways. It's useless to you. So this was kind of the concept behind technocracy, and you'll note that one of the things that they cover here in this article, it's the Technocrats magazine, is where's this? This seems very similar to what we talk about when it comes to AI systems. Photocell gives a brain to machines, and we're still talking about this to this day. This is the technocratic movement playing before our very eyes with regards to AI, social media, algorithms, software, etc. The reason why I cover this is because when I rant and rave about the tech industry, and the way that it's going and operating, and the my feelings first, and the push to have AI solve all our problems, it didn't happen in the 30s and it's not going to happen now, is because what you guys need to understand is that there is a history. There is a long history that started long before any of you or I were born, unless you happen to be like 80 or 90 years old, in which case salute and welcome in. But this kind of stuff was used for power plays. It's a way to control, society or societal factors. And I'm trying to be fair here. It's not like Howard Scott here, the creator of technocracy, had like some nefarious reason to be like, ha ha ha, petting their cat, in the back room of a dark lit place and going, ha ha, I will now control the world. He had a very kind of idealistic reason, right? Where he's like, look, we even went over it in this article, in this magazine. People are suffering. They're being kicked out of their homes. They're living in squalor. The war caused a Great Depression. This kind of like never-ending inflation of the US dollar. How is Uncle Sam going to save us from this? We have the answer. The answer is energy and machines. We already use them. We could solve all these problems. So if you just take it from that perspective, just for a moment, you can at least understand where Howard Scott is coming from. So we followed this path through. We talked about this. Then we talked about Joshua Haldeman, and I went into a deep dive, including a biography of what Joshua Haldeman was into. And he is from Canada, particularly around, I believe it was Manitoba, I want to say. But he was in charge of the technocratic movement in Canada. And he had some, well, he tailored a lot of his views around the technocratic movement, which he gathered by being exposed to Howard Scott in the United States. And the same kind of ideas come out of Joshua Haldeman in the Canadian, world. He was even at one point arrested for being a part of technocracy, partially because of some stupid thing where the Canadian government, in all their idiotic wisdom, decided that it was not good to make anti-fascist statements, I believe. I don't know. It was something like that. We went over it on that stream. However, Joshua Haldeman, as it turns out, having a fully believing in the technocratic movement, being a leader of it and having gone to jail over it, happens to be the grandfather of Elon Musk. And we went over how the technocratic movement, for example, wants to have a technate. And the technate map includes Canada, North America, essentially, and Greenland, which lines up with why it was so out of the blue when Elon Musk was all buddy-buddies with Trump in the White House, and Trump suddenly starts saying things like, we gotta take over Greenland ASAP, and it was becoming a very big thing. And ever since Elon has fallen out of favor in the White House, when was the last time you heard Trump talking about taking over Greenland? So we're pulling on this thread, and so now we're going to continue with this thread. And the thread continues with a movement that came up around the 1960s and 70s, as kind of like we're following a timeline here. The technocratic movement, this stuff, did not appear in a vacuum. It popped up in a variety of other places, and it continues to pop up in a variety of other places. Yeah, Gulf of America. That's right, I'm a god. Yep. And it appeared in different ways, but using the same principles and belief systems. Sometimes you can make a direct relation, a direct link to the technocratic movement if you map people's histories out. So I have to do a lot of deep diving into people's like history, biography, where they worked, see if there's a relation to like other technocratic leaders, etc., etc. But sometimes these things pop up on their own. And it infects kind of an ecosystem of the technological space. This is why I talk about it. Because you can see that once the idea is implanted in the technological ecosystem, people are then kind of like secondarily and tertiary affected by it. And so the idea pops up. And so we're going to talk about Chile. Chile is a completely different movement. And they call this the cybernetic or cybersyn revolution. So the reason why I'm bringing this one up is because we're going to see the technocratic fundamental principles play out in Chile in real life. This picture you see before you is a real picture of a control room that Chile had as part of the technocratic implementation in the 1970s. They just didn't call it technocracy. They called it cybernetic or cybersyn, cyber SYN, because they didn't know that there was a correlate technocratic movement happening. But by the 60s and 70s also, the technocratic movement was kind of shuttered away. Howard Scott kind of wasn't being very active about it. Joshua Haldeman was kind of parading around, South Africa, I believe, and flying planes and stuff and having babies, and which ended up with Elon and so on and so forth, right? So the entire concept of the technocratic movement kind of went dark a bit during this time. But this is an instance where different people came up with the technocratic movement, named it differently, and then implemented it in Chile. And so let's dig in a little bit into this. This is an extremely in-depth article. It's 324 pages. What I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll down real fast and I'm going to show you how in-depth this is. There's almost 150 pages dedicated to references and a glossary. It's super in-depth. Now, are we going to read all of this? No, that would take forever. So I'll give you the notes that are important. that I think are important, but I will add a little bit of, I will flesh it out a bit because I do think that this is an important a story to consider when we talk about technocracy and how it plays out in real life. So to begin with, we have this person, Stafford Beer. Stafford Beer was related. Okay, so basically he called himself a cybernetician. He was an engineer, a scientist of sorts. He was associated with Great Britain and Ireland as part of his work. He constantly had connections to Britain and Canada, by the way. He was he would do talks on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in Canada during his lifetime. He wrote a bunch of books, etc. He received, in July 1971, he received an unexpected letter from Chile. Its contents would dramatically change Beer's life. The writer was a young Chilean engineer named Fernando Flores, who was working for the government of newly elected socialist president Salvador Allende. Flores wrote that he was familiar with Beer's work in management cybernetics and was now in a position from which it is possible to implement on a national scale, at which cybernetic thinking becomes a necessity. Scientific views on management and organization. Flores asked Beer for advice on how to apply cybernetics to the management of the nationalized sector of the Chilean economy, which was expanding quickly because of Allende's aggressive nationalization policy. Less than a year earlier, Allende and his leftist coalition Popular Unity Party had secured the presidency and put Chile on a road toward socialist change. So the article, well, the book here, essentially, it's a book, continues with an increase in industrial output. There was a socialist revolution that happened, and they saw a positive increase in the amount of industry that happened as a result of this change. So, hey, Chile is on a good path. We have a lot of industrial capability on output. How are we going to ensure that we maintain a good, control and management over our industrial output? Because we want to capitalize on this, right? So as the party took hold, Beer and this Flores guy who belonged to the party in question right now continue going back and forth, and they're like, "Hey, man, wouldn't it be great if we use cybernetics?" And here's Stafford Beer. Okay, this was when he was employed at Sigma. Okay, and man, wouldn't it be great? We have a great test bed of a socialist country that we can apply this cybernetics movement. And when I say cybernetics here, I want you to think technocracy. And Beer goes, "You know what? You've sold me." So as they continue going back and forth, Flores gets more and more, influence in the party of Chile at the time. And let me just go down here. Okay. So at some point, Flores gets kind of like a promotion in the party, in the Chilean party. And so what he does, right, because of his competency here, it describes kind of his background and his competency. He gets a promotion, and then he goes, "Well, why don't we hire Beer?" And he persuades the Socialist Party at the time to fly Beer over from where he was at the time and consult on the Socialist Party and how they're going to implement cybernetics into this socialist government so that they can have a good form of control over their industrial output. Now, going down, skipping a few things. There's a whole model. They go back and forth. They talk about how this is going to work. Beer kind of takes he believes in socialism himself. He has to make a distinction that hey, I'm not a Marxist, but Marx had a few things that were correct. Why don't we implement kind of a few of the things that Marx had right, and tie that into my cybernetics, integration into your government, etc., etc. And so then during the first year of this party, Beer does a very kind of like in-depth analysis of how they would integrate cybernetics or machines as a way to manage the government as a whole, the entire nation, particularly inputs and outputs, energy usage, industrial usage, optimizing it, min-maxing it, the whole 9 yards, communication, all of it. Now, I got to go down a bit. I know there's a picture. Okay. So they start with Project Cybersyn. So here we go. So Project Cybersyn is a synthesis of cybernetics and synergy. And essentially what this project becomes is the idea of cybernetics, the idea of machines in charge of decisions, more or less, with the synergism, if you will. I wonder if we've heard that term before in, VC funding, tech bro stuff, this synergistic, whatever synergism, technology, whatever, synergizing with our users, yada, yada. So this has existed since the 60s here in an entirely different country. And the idea here is that you take humans at the top who synergize with the machinery, and they take the raw information, and there's some people at the top who are heavily qualified because of their academics in terms of math and science to turn the machine inputs and outputs and either help the machine make decisions or make decisions themselves out of information out of the machine. They then create this thing called telex, which is essentially the internet, but for Chile. They literally created an internet system that could send communications through pretty much the entirety of Chile instantly, almost instantly. It was it was crazy how fast this thing worked. It was like a prerequisite to kind of technology to having the entire system work. It was a prerequisite to the internet as a whole. They essentially built it right there. So let's continue down. They build all these systems, and then blah, 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 blah. Where does it go? Yada, yada. These are pictures of... Okay. And so here's a drawing of the actual control room that they ended up with. This is the cybersyn control. This was a real thing. This is a real control room that they actually built. It looks like something out of when you see those movies where there's a bunch of bad guys at the top who are all equally in charge, and you go to the top of the building and they're all making bad decisions together. This is the kind of room. And the chairs have buttons and information display outputs. And then there's a central console. And from here, the people who have been chosen because of their academic prowess to make decisions based on the information that was coming out of these machines sat in this room, and they would spread communications using the telex system and the cybersyn input-output of the machines. They would do things like determine when coal would have to be transported from, say, one place or another. So they tried this out. Look at this. They even have a layout. They have a schematic. There's a blueprint on this entire process. This is exactly how they laid it out. You can see that there was an actual picture at the beginning. Here's another layout. They figured it all out. And here we go. Here's a picture. This was real. This looks like something out of for 1971. This is crazy that this is a real picture. But yes, this is a real room. They sat in here. They made their decisions based on the inputs and outputs of the machines, just like this. Tack, thank you, man. Thank you, Tack. I appreciate that. Thanks for the sub. Welcome in. That's great. Penis. Yeah, that's great. So here you go. Here's some of the inputs and outputs that they saw on these machines. You can see production, global, the assistance thing. You can kind of see some of the stuff here. These are the algedonic screens from the cybersyn operations room, right? And so they have this it's crazy. They have an output where so essentially what happens here is that the people, when there's a multi-level decision that they have to make, it goes down this chain of events where this is the cybernetic thing where you have to have everybody has to kind of go through a chain of steps in order to get to a conclusion, which then allows for a decision to go out and communicated as an action to the, whoever is affected by the action. This is crazy. So this is why I wanted to bring this up, because this was actually applied. This is technocracy in action. You're seeing it right before you playing out. Look at this chair. This would be what a technocratic government would look like. You would have someone who is, a master mathematician or something like that. And they would sit on a chair like this and they would push buttons and they'd talk to each other and they'd make governmental federal decisions. Okay. And they would do so apparently at the speed of light, because technology produces communication, at the speed of light, that's kind of the goal here, right? Here's like a preview, like an artist conception of the buttons here. Okay, and what it was supposed to hold. And here it is. That's an armrest. All these buttons did something. This, I'm not joking. This is real. This is real stuff. This actually happened. So they would just communicate with each other. They all had different jobs, right? And they would have these metrics that they would have to go through, which was also highlighted on the board, and it would light up. So you can imagine, for example, that you would have one person in that room of chairs who was dedicated to like the potentiality of like doing some quick math and figuring out the potentiality of a decision. Somebody else would have to do quick math in the productivity or whatever. And when decisions had to be made, they would have to essentially like coordinate. And then there was like a light up system where when somebody thought, nah, the productivity is not worth it, and then somebody would go, but the potentiality is, and you'd essentially come to like a systemic if else switch case statement until enough of the positives outweighed the negatives in a systemic like numerical pattern, something like this. And then you'd come out to a decision, and then the system would just relay that decision out to the entire Chilean government. As we continue, what happened is that in 1972, let me just go down. I got to go find it. Bear with me, folks. This was a very long contradictions. A technology of contradictions. I'll make the long story short to kind of get us to the end. So 1971, they build the system. 1971, they use the system. In 1971, this system does fantastic. The socialist movement is in full force. The amount of production output that the Chilean government enjoys is huge. They're about ready to like break out throughout the whole world. They're about ready to make a ton of money. The cybersyn system is proving to be highly effective. The communication factor it's really, really good. This is the telex network. Their ability to make decisions seems to be playing out really, really well. However, what happens is that they miss a few really critical things. And I'm going to point some of them out. And again, for those who have ears, listen. So what is this section of the book talking about? Well, let's read just a little bit. I'm going to read from it because it's better to read from it instead of me summarizing. What they wanted to do was they wanted to make cybersyn more political. The State Development Corporation increasingly separated the project from its cybernetic underpinnings. What was happening was that the political party in power at the time started seeing cybersyn as a merely input-output tool and not as a tool for political decisions. And Beer went, this thing has political impact and you guys better use it for politics. It's more than just an input-output decision machine. And there started to be this kind of divergence between the political party going, what are you talking about? We have our own problems to deal with politically. You just go do the thing you're good at, which is dealing with production numbers and energy numbers and all of that. And so the people who were involved in cybersyn were starting to feel kind of left out by the political party. And there was a bit of a push and pull, right? Work on Project Cybersyn accelerated after the strike. In 1973, there was a strike where the workers had enough. Why did the workers have enough? Because despite the fact that the Chilean government was saying, hey, isn't everything great? In fact, things were not great. And the workers were being mismanaged. Workers were being more overworked. Management of things like coal generation, for example, was being mismanaged heavily. So as an example, let me see if I can find this example. The following anecdote explains why Chilean factory managers did not view the system as useful. An interventor from a cement factory discovered a serious coal shortage in his factory. He decided to visit the supplying coal mine to learn the cause of the problem. He traveled to the mine, personally spoke to the miners, and explained the importance of maintaining the coal supply. He then created a log to show when trains were available that could bring coal to the factory from the mine. Several days after the interventor returned to his cement factory, he received a notice from Project Cybersyn telling him of a potential shortage. Do you guys understand? Do you guys understand what happened here? What technology could not account for is the fact that human-to-human interaction can far outpace and solve problems before a technology could even discover the problem to begin with. And one of the reasons why is because they built, if we look at, I wonder if telex room. Okay, I can't remember exactly where it is in this book, but they built essentially a cloud room, kind of like Amazon. They built like an Amazon bucket room, except they actually kept it secure. What they had to do was they had to build a cloud room of servers, and the telex network would receive information and send information, and they'd put it up on a centralized cloud system. I can't find it right now. I'm sure I've seen it somewhere in here. And the cloud system would have to process the data, and then it would send that data out to the command and control room at the top here, and it was that data that would provide these people the ability to make decisions. Now, granted, to be objectively fair, this is a part of the reason why the technology lagged behind human interaction is we are talking about the 60s. So you got to be fair, right? In the 60s, the kind of data processing that was available would not be the same as we have today. So we can't look at it from a modern lens, right? We have to look at it from the lens of at the time. So they had it like a cloud-based infrastructure. They had the internet. They had technocracy implemented in a room that was exactly this. This is the real room. And then let's go back to the contradictions. However, the workers were not happy because the workers were noticing that as the system lagged behind and as they had to wait for these people to come up with like their methodology and their mathematical energy inputs and outputs, they could just go talk to a human being. They could just go talk to a human being and they could solve these problems. That one anecdote, by the way, was not a singular anecdote. There were many other anecdotes. There were many other reasons as well, because these systems did not account for things like overworked. I believe it was overworked workers. I could be wrong on that. Don't quote me on that. But in any case, there were problems with it, right? So now you have a system where a strike happens and the workers are unhappy and the Chilean government goes, what the hell? You guys were supposed to be able to be in control of this. How about you just stick to your lane? Just stick to your lane. We're having a strike here, and it's causing the Chilean government an inability to break out into the world as a powerhouse producer of like raw earth minerals like coal and stuff like this. We're right there. We're on the precipice of it. Our socialist government could prove that we could make billions of dollars by selling, all this production stuff that we have. Yeah, you guys did great with your cybersyn network. Just stick to your lane though, because you're making people pissed off and they're striking against us. Okay. It's weakening our power. And in 1973, we have to go through another election, and we need to keep the people happy. Okay, so you guys just stick to your lane and we'll deal with the politics. And the cybersyn people go, no, cybersyn is intended to take over politicians and bureaucracy. That's the technocratic movement. you don't have people who are politicians. You don't have political policy. You have nothing but the cybersyn setup where you have people who are in charge of raw computing inputs and outputs as fast, or in this case, as slow as a computing system can judge. The end of 1972 starts taking hold, and the party starts noticing more and more pushback. And now news articles are being created in Chile, and they're starting to talk about how the cybernetic movement is Marxist in nature. They bring up Marxism because they point to Beer, and they kind of straw man him, and they go, look, Beer, the guy who created this, he's a Marxist. He wasn't really like a full-on Marxist. He just had particular things he agreed with Karl Marx on. And because socialism and communism and Marxism kind of have overlaps, the propaganda machine started to play against the government and go, haha, you guys don't like Marxism, even though you're socialist. And look, the person who created the system that you guys hate so much, well, he's a Marxist, right? And so we see the propaganda start in like late 1972. And then in 1973, things take a dramatic turn. In 1973, the Chilean government starts seeing a massive decline in their overall production output. They were starting to become a country in 1972 that had a surplus of almost, I can't remember the exact, it was like over $100 million in surplus, which in 1960 dollars is a huge amount. They were going to be a dominant powerhouse. It was almost there. Then in 1973, they had a trade deficit of $438 million, declining production, and a 180.3% increase in prices in the previous 12 months. The class war intensified because what started to happen is the shift started to go away from the cybernetic movement, and the people started seeing the government that included the cybernetic movement, but not exclusively to them, as a bourgeois power play. And so they started striking even harder. So now you start factoring in all of these things. The cybernetic movement cannot, do the things that it needs to be doing. People are falling behind. The production value is falling behind. The cybernetic system, the cybersyn system, that control room isn't operating the way it should. They're not capable of making decisions as quickly as they could and or should be. You factor in all of these things, and then you have strikes, and then what you have is the inability for these systems to even continue to operate at full capacity because of the strikes. So what happens for a temporary moment in time, and again, for those who have ears, listen. For a temporary moment in time, I wonder if I can find it here. I can't remember which page it's on. I should really take notes and put it on my... Okay, so around 1973, early 1973, I'm going to have to go off memory because I read it like yesterday. What happened, the political party at the time and cybersyn put their differences aside for a moment, because as the strikes and the unrest grew, what they realized is that they could use the telex internet system to quell the protests. And indeed, it worked, because what they did was they used this system to gather as much information as they could about their citizens by looking at work productivity outputs per employee. They drilled down to individual employees. They looked at higher levels of communications in certain parts of the country versus lower, which gave them an indication of where protests and unrest were more likely to happen, because a lower level of communication would mean that these workers were working less, and so then they would be more inclined to protest and cause issues, things like this. They would communicate, they would send out like people who would do things like, heavily police and monitor neighborhoods, and then they would use the telex, internet system to very quickly send information about potential upcoming unrest by having these, policed areas send information like that. So they used the system and kind of warped it into a tracking mechanism. And in so doing, they were able to hold at bay the political unrest that happened. Unfortunately, they couldn't hold it forever. It only happened, they could only contain it for a little while. And between 1973 and 1974, the political party lost so much steam that they had to essentially get disbanded by force. They were overthrown, and there was, I believe, a military coup. Yes. They were attacked. The presidential palace was attacked with tanks. And during this period of time, the political party made a hard exit away from cybersyn and said, you know what? I don't care about your technological quantifications and calculations. What are you going to do when I'm being attacked by weapons? That's what the leader of the party said to Beer publicly. How are you going to help me when I'm being attacked by weapons? This fancy little, internet connected thing, and your fancy cloud-based system and your command and control center and all this fancy telecommunication stuff. How is this going to help me when I have people with tanks rolling up? And they suffered several months of hard ostracism and divergency from the political socialist government at the time, until eventually it happened. They got taken over because the amount of unrest just built up, and these people took it upon themselves. This story serves as a warning. Do you understand the warnings? And do you understand the positives? Because there are positives in this story. Do you understand what those are? And so again, I say, for those who have ears, listen. This is an example of how this kind of movement, which has almost the same principles as the technocratic movement, can operate, can appear on its own, if that makes sense, in an independent fashion in a completely different country. And here's how it played out in real life when implemented. Are there good aspects? Sure. Are there bad aspects? Sure. Pay attention. And we're going to continue down this thread as I continue the Daily Tech News streams. There is a timeline of these things where they pop up seemingly independently, but they essentially just kind of all come from the same thing. And it is about this time in the 1960s where you start to see people who become more and more, let's say, impacted by this technocratic ideology. It's not called technocracy in every case, but it has the same principles. And what you're going to start to see, I'm going to cover it in an upcoming stream, is that there becomes a series of scientific kind of like pushes. Inside of the scientific ecosystem comes scientific papers and studies and things like this, which promote the idea of technocracy, which promote the idea of the merging of biology with machines, the merging of brains with machines, or in some cases, the entire replacement of brains, human brains with machines. We'll cover a little bit of that too. Through this principled ideology, the principle of this ideology, I mean. So we're going to follow that thread through, and we're going to see how this stuff pops up, because this is the history of the programming field. And this ideological battleground continues to play out right now today. It just shows up in different forms. And you have to be aware of what you're getting yourself into and why it's really, really important that you understand about the things that really matter in this industry. This kind of ideology and this kind of raw adherence, strict adherence to these kinds of things, you really need to give a second thought as to the impact that this has on the world, and whether people are kind of hand-holding the tech industry to lead it to a particular thing. And when I talk about things like AI making scientific discoveries, the addictive properties of AI, etc., you have to take this into consideration. They forgot their purely logical and rational systems are dealing with humans that are not always logical and rational.